Yes, yes.
Okay, we're going to call to order the February 2025 meeting of the Homewood Planning Commission. If we could please start with a roll call.
All right. Mr. Henninger.
Here.
Ms. Wilcott. Here. Mr. Harwell. Mr. Respento.
Here.
Mr. Armstead.
Here.
Mr. Broadhead. Ms. Andress.
Here.
Mr. Gulas.
Here.
And Mr. Roberts.
Here, thank you. All right, moving on. Fred sent around the minutes from the December meeting earlier this week, or I think it might have been last week. I took a look at them. That looked very good as normal to me. Unless anyone has some concerns, I would entertain a motion to dispense with the reading.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, so that, the minutes are approved. Moving on, communications. Mr. Armstead, do you have any communications as vice chair?
I do not.
Okay. All right, as chair, just a couple things, one relating to tonight and one relating to another event. First of all, we are planning on or hoping to have a special meeting of the Planning Commission Subcommittee meeting on the 19th of this month at 5:30 in the council chambers. It will be, be in the committee room. Sorry, thank you. It'll be to discuss a case that's coming up in March. I know we weren't able to determine whether there would be a quorum, so we're gonna, I guess, go reach out this week to see if we have enough people, sufficient people for that meeting. Right. And if so, it'll take place on the 19th at 5:30. The second thing that this relates to tonight, we have two related cases. We know that there's some public input. We've gotten plenty of input from the public electronically over, and I think phone calls, emails, et cetera, over the last few days, and we've seen all that. We see several of you here tonight to speak on the case, so I just wanted to remind everyone, first of all, we're thankful you're here. We appreciate your input. I understand that there's a PowerPoint presentation that's going to be given from some of the neighbors. We appreciate that as well. The one thing I would counsel everyone is if we could avoid in our public comments, avoid repetitive comments. If we try to keep our comments, except for the PowerPoint presentation, which I know is a little longer, if we try to keep our comments to three or 4 minutes, that would be appreciated. And furthermore, if you could, try to avoid repetition. If someone has made the point 2 or 3 times, that we would have heard it by that point. So, with all that being said, we'll get started with new business. There are, again, 2 related cases. They are RZ 25-02-01 and RZ 25-0202. Both relate to 101 to 109 Hughes Circle. One's a rezoning case. One is a final development plan case. The applicant is Cadre Engineering. Whoever's here to speak on this case would come forward now. And this is gonna be a third announcement. I said there were only 2, but everyone who comes up, if you speak, please state your name in the record, give us your address, and also write your name and address on the log on the dais there.
Is it your intent to discuss them simultaneously but vote on them separately? Is that the way you want to handle it?
I think so. I think that makes sense. If the applicant's comfortable discussing both cases at once as opposed to breaking them out.
Yes, sir.
The zonings.
Yeah, we can do that. I'm Brian Hatcher with Cadre Engineering, 5572 Carrington Lake Parkway, Trussville, Alabama. We are here tonight presenting for the development plan for 101 to 109 Hughes Circle and the rezoning of those same lots from currently Neighborhood Plan District NPD to PR2. I've got with us tonight John Chapman with Wind Capital Partners and Gray Plosser with KPS. They'll do the PowerPoint presentation and kind of talk through the specifics of the development as a whole, but in general, this development takes the 101 to 109 existing residential lots. The plan would be into the future vacate Hughes Circle with a future resurvey and a future meeting, and combine that into one lot and do a combination 3-story building, assisted living memory care with 24 independent living cottages transitioning up the hill to the residential behind it to the north. I'll let John kind of talk about their program, what they're doing, and present the PowerPoint as well. But we would like to do both items at one time since they are dependent on each other anyway.
Sure, thank you.
Sign in now. Good evening, Commission. As Brian said, I'm John Chapman, Ferris Properties, 2400 Arlington Avenue. We're pleased to be before you tonight to present what we believe is a very needed and great opportunity for the city and for a lot of our senior residents here in the community. I'm going to be joined by several folks tonight. Again, Ferris is the role of developer in the project. Our architect of record is KPS Group, led by Gray Plosser, who's one of the principals at KPS. And I think also worth noting, a big part of the discussion tonight we anticipate will be the request to rezone from Neighborhood Preservation District to a different residential classification. And so Gray's knowledge and history, he formerly was chairman of the Alabama Historic Commission, and so as part of his work there, he understands fully the historic fabric of a community, both with its buildings and with its neighborhoods. And so I think that's very relevant, and we're glad to have Gray on our team. His group at KPS also performed the master plan for the city back in 2004, which again is now, 20 years old. Time moves quickly, and I guess that's relevant to the discussion here tonight as well, too, with our seniors proposal. But that master plan called out several things that are also still very relevant. That's the commercial corridors that exist, the neighborhoods that exist, and how we transition appropriately from those neighborhoods into the commercial areas as well. Brian Hatcher just spoke with Cadre. He's part of our team. Our operator for the project is Atlas Senior Living. They're a Birmingham-based operator. They operate regionally throughout the Southeast. They currently operate 36 seniors-specific facilities across the Southeast. And so I'll be fielding questions as they relate to operations tonight, but they're on our team, and we're glad to have them. We have a 10-year relationship with their principals. We're invested in several projects with them. And again, we're very pleased that they happen to be local, but they're also a best-in-class operator. Our general contractor for the project will also be a local contractor. Brassfield and Gorey, we have a great relationship with them and have constructed several jobs with them. They've worked with us on pricing, and so we anticipate they will be the contractor of the project. So I think all of that is relevant and worth noting because the project we're presenting tonight that will contain the 112 units of seniors housing for this site is being designed by locals, built by locals. It'll be lived in by locals, owned and operated by locals who will have friends, family, associates who will occupy those units. So we hope tonight that the project itself is not fully being vetted, but also we hope the team behind the project's being vetted. And so we do think it's very important that we have the local, fully local project team. And as questions are raised tonight and thoughts about other locations for seniors projects that might be brought forth by other groups, those folks might not be a fully local team. And so I do think it's worth noting that we do have best-in-class operators presenting the project tonight. Questions have also been raised regarding the economics of the project. I'm just going to put that out here because it won't be part of our later presentation. But the project will be corporately owned, and again, it'll be maintained as a best-in-class facility. Anticipated ad valorem taxation would certainly be multiples of what it currently is on the tax rolls at currently. The 9 parcels that we're going to speak to tonight as one project currently have a tax assessed value of $4.1 million. And so we anticipate this project would be 10, 12, 15 times that. The question was raised earlier, so I wanted to address that. As it relates to our interest in the seniors housing deliverable and confirmation of the need, we engaged a firm known as Senior Market Research Associates. They're a national seniors housing research firm. Highlights of those report, which again, the report was done in kind of a textbook type analysis, where you look at the primary market area to be served by the project. Typically those are within the 5 to 10 mile range. It was determined for this specific location that it might be more appropriate to look at needs within a 5-mile radius. So if you do that, some statistics that were presented in the report, again, that I think are very relevant. If you look at the total inventory within that, again, 5-mile kind of geographic bullseye, if you will, from our site, or our proposed site, there are currently 780 independent living units available, 278 assisted living units available, and 176 memory care units available. All levels of those deliverables are currently between 90 and 93% occupied. The report further defines the elderly population is those persons who are 65 years or older. Again, within this 5-mile radius, there's identified to be just over 40,600 persons who meet that criteria. It's roughly 16% of the population. It's worth noting that over the past 12 years, that population growth has exploded, I would say, and has increased by 76%. It is also forecasted in the coming 5 years, which is about as far out as these reports analyze, that all segments of the 65-year-plus population is projected to increase. Breaking that down a little further, persons between the age of 65 and 74 are projected to increase at 15%, and persons aged 75 years or older are projected to increase 29%, again within our 5-mile geographic area. When you look at those reports, again, they're kind of textbook, so they kind of look very scientifically and draw bullseyes around your project and radiuses. I think our opinion varies a little bit from the textbook type analysis, because we've operated, our firm has operated in the city of Homewood since 2007. Our firm started in 2005. We currently operate around 750 multifamily units in that same 5-mile radius. And through our experience operating those properties over the years, you know, we've gotten to meet families who have brought grandparents to Homewood from Gadsden, from Montgomery, from all over parts of the country, really, who want to be closer to their family and to their grandkids. And so, again, having operated these properties now for 10, 15 years, those folks have aged. And so the question just really is, you know, now that they're losing their sense of complete independence, but are not ready for a skilled nursing facility or higher acuity level of care, where do they go? And so when we look at kind of the broad landscape of the city of Homewood and its various parcels that might be available for development, that seem to check boxes as it relates to a seniors deliverable, a couple of things were critical to us and our team and what we want to deliver. We don't want to be in a non-core location. We think it's very important for a senior property to be easily accessible by family members who want to visit. You know, you don't want to develop a project that's seen to be kind of on the outskirts or fringe, or that's not convenient for folks to visit. Because as good of a thought as it is that, you know, you're going to visit your family member who might be in a seniors project, the reality is it doesn't occur as often as you think. So for those projects to be well located in a core location, for us and for the type best-in-class project that we want to deliver, having that location is very critical to us. Additionally, as seniors housing has evolved through the course of its existence now over a couple decades, the new concept of a cottage-style independent living structure was introduced several years ago, and it's very much desirable. It creates kind of a sense of independence. The transition in your life stage into a seniors project is never easy. Change is never easy. What we're going to talk about tonight, and neighbors and friends of our community are going to get up and stand up here and they'll agree. There's one thing we can all agree on is that change is tough. And so to transition into seniors housing, when you have a cottage deliverable, that independent living concept is an easier sell to family members to get them into a seniors community. And once they're there, then they can more easily transition into a higher level of care, whether it's assisted living or memory care. So this site certainly stands out to us. It checks a lot of boxes. Gray is going to take the mic here in just a second and describe to you his opinion of the site and its relevance and why we believe a change from MPD to a PR2 zoning makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to turn it over to Gray Plosser.
Thank you, John. Fred, where's the switch? Beg your pardon?
I think. You speaking to the microphone, sir?
No, for the,
They have it in the back,
oh,
so you'll just tell him next slide.
oh, gotcha, thank you. It's my age group. I hate to be the object of research. But I can attest to all of those things. So, next slide, please. I want to talk about the site. I suppose I'm a potential candidate for it. Our firm does a fair amount of this kind of work, and it is changing very rapidly. My daughter's an architect, for which I'm very proud, but she specializes in housing for the elderly, or perhaps more specifically, helping people to age in place in their existing housing. Because there's a lot about most housing that's universal that is not necessarily the best for folks as they become older. We have done some of these cottages that John was referring to. They are very popular. But there's more to them than just a cottage. They're actually things that are purposefully designed to make it easier and safer for the elderly to negotiate them and live in them. So, so with that, let me talk about the site a moment. You know where it is, the red, this is just a Google screenshot of the area.
I have a request from the back. Brian's asking, can you move to the center of the podium, please? Thank you. I'm sorry. I think the microphone's better.
Oh,
Yeah, thank
I'm
you. That was a
sorry.
request in the back. Thank
I
you.
didn't know which one was. So anyway, you know where it is. You can see the surrounding context there. So everyone is really familiar with it. So next slide. This is a screenshot of your Homewood zoning map. And you see in the tan the area that's currently zoned the Neighborhood Preservation District. And it includes, and which is surrounded by other higher intensity uses. But the green is basically institutional uses. The hot colors, the reds and the purples and that sort of thing, are all commercial uses, mostly office space. And the bright reds are multifamily housing. It really consists of two subdivisions, the Ashley Drive subdivision and the Hugh Circle subdivision. Hugh Circle subdivision was actually platted in about 1943, I think. And the Ashley Drive subdivision was platted, I think, about 7 or 8 years prior to that, in the 30s. And as you can see there, they back up to one another. They're contiguous. They back up to one another. They don't share a street, but they do share some common backyards. They are nestled, as it were, like a lot of things along Lake Shore, in and amongst much higher intensity and very different uses. They vary from Lakeshore Foundation and Lakeshore Hospital across the street, to Sanford, to another church, to the YMCA, and so forth, so to public school. So Lakeshore Corridor has become a very different thing over the last 30 to 40 years. Next. So let's look a little more specifically at the site. This shows the proposed plan that essentially entails two, and hopefully you can tell, the proposed site is right in the middle. Ashley Drive is noted as, you can't see a huge circle on this. But there are two fundamental different characters of housing on the site. Essentially, the development entails single-family type housing for independent seniors, mostly couples who wish to downsize their housing, secure additional amenities, access to services, and so forth. Just like they would mostly in a regular single-family neighborhood. All are single-story. Most of them have carports, and for those who wish them, but many will not drive. The housing part is located adjacent to the single-family housing on Ashley Drive. So we have, in essence, single-family housing backing up to single-family housing. And it is a little more dense in terms of the number of units per acre, so to speak. But nevertheless, the north part of the site furthest away from Lakeshore, is devoted to those cottages, as John was describing. The southern part of the site is the assisted living building, it's 3 stories high. It's adjacent to Lakeshore Boulevard, where the more similar sized buildings and scale of buildings exist. And it's also the farthest away from the Ashley Drive subdivision on the property. So you can see there First Baptist Church and the parking deck for Sanford's office buildings over there. All are larger buildings, also bordering the neighborhood. Next slide. This is a little closer view of the site development plan. And it shows the layout of the building, streets, sidewalks, landscaping, automobile ingress and egress to the site. As was mentioned, the proposed ingress-egress is from Old 31. The State Highway Department, who controls Lakeshore, or maybe I should say has a major say in Lakeshore and in Old 31, is very much of a mind that it wants the ingress-egress to be on Old 31 rather than on Lakeshore. So that initial ingress is about 350 feet up the street, up Old 31 from the intersection. It was mentioned there's a second one. It's up on the far left side. You see another egress. That is really an emergency egress only. It's intended to allow emergency services vehicles to be able to egress. So it would be normally locked and only available to them and for their use. There's also, you can see a connection on the right, which connects over to the First Baptist Church parking lot. We also had a traffic study, a preliminary traffic study done by Skipper and Associates consultants to assess the trip generation for vehicles that would be associated with this development. It's a science, I suppose. It's a little dark to me, but nevertheless, they use tables that are developed nationwide by the National Association of Traffic Engineers. They update them regularly, and they do them by building type, and they survey them regularly and so forth. So they use data from those tables, and they did so based on the bed counts and so forth in this project. They ascertained that during morning peak hour, that this development would generate one vehicle in or out every 4 to 5 minutes. And during the afternoon peak hour, every 3 to 5 minutes. That squares, and the peak hours are a little bit different. They're not exactly the 8 and the 6 because the shifts are different and so forth with staff, which actually spreads them out a little more across a 24-hour period. But the net effect of that projected vehicular activity is essentially that it would be unnoticeable. In other words, given the traffic on the adjacent streets, that impact is something less than 3 to 4%. And therefore, at one vehicle every 4 to 5 minutes or every 3 to 5 minutes, essentially it's not going to be noticeable. So the project will conform to all of the city's requirements, whether it's stormwater management or whether it's your landscape ordinances and so forth. All of those we will comply with. We understand them and work with them regularly. In addition, if you look along the very top of the site, that's the area that's contiguous to the Ashley Drive subdivision. That area is proposed to have a buffer area. It consists basically of a 30-foot setback minimum across the back. It varies from 30 to more than 50 feet. As well as a dense 10-foot landscaping buffer closest to the property line itself. And the content and the planting and so forth is described on the plans. And they are intended to be provide year-round kinds of screening, and as well as being very dense. It is important, however, to note that this new development is substantially lower than, or will be substantially lower than what is above it on the north side. So the two lines that you see are section lines. They're as though we sliced down through the site at each of those points, from Lakeshore all the way up through to Ashley Drive. The next slide. And perhaps they're a little hard to see, but these are what we call site sections. And the gray area on the bottom is the dirt, is the earth. On the far right is Lakeshore. On the far left, up at the top of both, you see houses drawn there. Those are houses on Ashley Drive. And you see the development in between. There's a dash line that goes across the top of both sections. The dash line is where the existing grades are. And you can see here that the site, particularly on the uphill side, on the left-hand side, is being lowered. That's in order for two reasons. Number one, because the site is has a fair grade to it, and we want to be able to make the site meet accessibility standards for vehicles as well as people walking. And so we have to reduce the slope. That means cutting it down on the uphill side and using that dirt to help build the platform on the low side for the larger building. It balances on the site, but the result is that those single-story houses sitting in the middle there are significantly lower than the houses are now on the upper part of Hughes Circle. There's one other line up there that I'll refer you to. There's a red dashed line on the upper section. That red dashed line is the height, the maximum height of single-family houses, current zoning, that could be built on that site as the grades sit currently. So Homewood's ordinance says 35 feet. So that line is what could be done there under the current zoning. You know, today we don't build single-story homes for everybody. Everybody wants a two-story home. It's the way you get more square footage on little lots, I'm told. But that's the norm, and particularly in more expensive neighborhoods, that's the way you get additional value and higher prices. So the site section is interesting. It shows the development. It gives you an idea, and you can also see the setback noted up there, wider at the side closest to it, gets narrower as you go up, and you also see the landscape in it that would be planted in that heavily landscaped buffer area. Next slide. So that's the plan. There's a lot I haven't perhaps covered, but the other piece of this is always what's it going to look like, and which everyone has a right to ask as well. We're fortunate. Homewood, both my grandparents lived in Homewood. I've been hanging around Homewood for a long, long time, and one in Mayfair and one in Hollywood, and getting in trouble occasionally, I guess. But Homewood is blessed with some great neighborhoods, wonderful. And it also is blessed more so than most other residential suburbs in Birmingham with a neat variety of styles, historical. And so this just gives you a picture of that. We go around and look, take photographs to get an idea of what the feel of the neighborhoods are. And this is just some examples. And what you see is sort of two prominent things that stand out a lot in Homewood. One is the Hollywood kind of old Spanish style. The other is what we call Homewood Tudor. And they're generally brick, they have higher pitched roofs and so forth, and Tudor details. But those two things struck us, next slide, as being in part the fundamentals of the character of many of Homewood's older neighborhoods. One other thing, some of you may remember, most of you may not, is the old Hollywood Country Club. It's on the side of the Marriott Hotel. Burned down a long time ago, but I remember it. I used to go swimming over there all the time. It was a great old building, and it's very close to where this site. It's just the other side of 31 Cloverleaf. Next slide. There it is. It was built in that sort of Spanish, eclectic Spanish style, and there were dances and card rooms and food and a huge swimming pool. So we thought that also represented an interesting historical bit of information. And so between those neighborhood pictures and this, we began to develop the imagery, next slide, of what this might be like. So this is just a picture on one of the internal streets proposed of the development. You see cottages, houses on the left, sort of the Tudor style. You see the assisted living building, the larger building on the right, in that Spanish style. Next slide. Looking back the other way. All this is just intended to give you a little bit of feel for the character, not the nuts and bolts of what it is and the figures and the numbers and the square footages, but what it might look like. It's important to make a contribution to the community whenever you touch it. At least that's our view. We ought to leave it better than when we found it. The basis for that in this case, and in many cases, is oftentimes finding what the key is in the existing and surrounding neighborhoods that you can relate to and hang your hat on. So that gives you a quick look. We also have a little video, if it works. There it is. This is coming up Old 31 and then turning into the proposed development. There is a clubhouse, probably failed to mention a small clubhouse that's primarily for the independent residents and the people in the cottages. It's right at the entrance, right there on the left. And then you can see the courtyard and the entrance to the assisted living facility there as you come in and drive around. I don't know how they do this, and I don't know how, but it has a Spanish feel to it, and the buildings themselves are meant to be, even though it's a large building, to be residential in feeling. You see balconies and trellises and things that are common to residential facilities. Outdoor eating. So, John?
I would just leave our presentation maybe with just a few quick follow-ups. Like we've touched on, we're very mindful and respect the challenge that we've brought to the commission, in that we are asking the commission to look open-mindedly at a parcel that is currently zoned the Neighborhood Preservation District. We're certainly appreciative of that zoning. You know, as someone who's invested in Homewood for a lot of years and thinks Homewood does so much right, certainly Neighborhood Preservation District is very high on that list. And in so many cases, that precedence and the presence of neighborhood preservation districts are very, very relevant. I would just ask the commission to consider this particular parcel and how it communicates with other neighbors. It's relatively isolated. You know, when I've kind of immersed myself in the neighborhood preservation district narrative in the zoning piece, and I've bothered Cale and pinged him with all kinds of questions. But you know, you try to look at what is the spirit of this zoning, anticipating and trying to protect. And so, you know, our view of Hugh as it currently sits now is that there is no pedestrian access to Ashley or Rhodes. You know, if you're a resident on Hugh now, you're getting in your vehicle, you're leaving Hugh down a pretty steep grade topographically, which is important because sidewalks become impractical. So to go visit your neighbors, you're getting in your car, you're driving, you're hitting Lakeshore, then up Old 31, and then over to Ashley. So it's that connectivity and kind of the spirit of neighborhoods that we think is absent from this parcel. And really, we're hoping that the development we're proposing, by installation of these kind of meandering vehicular roads and the sidewalks we're bringing, and really kind of an assemblage of enough people to create a self-sustaining community, that we truly are complying with the spirit of the Neighborhood Preservation District, while we're still maintaining a residential zoning. So we thank you for your time, and I'm going to yield the microphone now. We'll certainly answer questions that come up. And
Yeah, thank you. We'll hold the questions until after the public portion.
sure.
Thank you.
you.
And before I open up the public portion, one other announcement. I think that's four. And I think most of you probably know this. The Planning Commission, at least on these two cases, are advisory to the City Council. This case, regardless if it passes with the unanimous vote or goes down with unanimous vote, goes to the City Council, and they're the ultimate decision maker with respect to whether this passes. So with that being said, we're going to open, and again with a reminder to try to keep things concise and non-repetitive. With that, we'll open up the public portion of the hearing and ask anyone from the public if they want to come forward and speak.
My name is Andy Sims. I've lived at 3508 Ashley Circle for 31 years.
And I'm Jason Hopper. I live at 3510 Ashley Circle, and I've lived there for 9 years.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you today. We wanted to speak on behalf of Ashley Circle, Ashley Road, and Rhodes Drive neighbors. we have not, in the week that we've known about this, been able to get in touch with everybody, but we have been able to get in touch with most people. So we represent the majority of our neighbors who are opposed to this zoning and development. We wanted to give this to you in a very concise, non-emotional way, in a PowerPoint presentation, so that you avoid, Mr. Roberts, the repetition and everybody piling on to the same comments. So we hope that this will be a concise presentation for you. You can go to the next slide, please. We're here to present our concerns regarding the rezoning and development proposal of Hugh Circle. Our properties, my house and Jason's house, we live next door to each other, in particular, are the neighbors in question. We share backyards with Hugh Circle. And we're here to advocate for our neighbors, the preservation of our neighborhood's character, and prevent adverse impacts, not just for here and our neighbors, but also for the city of Homewood. We think that neighborhood preservation district is there for a reason. We think it's ironic that KPS put some of those tenants in place for the Homewood City Master Plan, and now, although they're being paid by someone else, is now on the other side. So for the next slide, we're gonna talk about we could talk probably dozens of reasons why this should be rejected, but we're gonna focus in on 7, which I think will be pertinent to your case and your cause.
Yeah, I think the first on the incompatibility, and this is the first time I've ever been in front of the council anywhere, and I don't know anything about zoning, so you go to school and you get a letter in your mailbox and go to a meeting on the Sunday. So I'm gonna hit some things, and these are more questions, perhaps rhetorical, and things that, as I started this journey, what does this mean? What's actually Circle mean? What's MPD mean? And it's in the, Article 5, and it recognizes that, Homewood has a commitment to the historical patterns and densities of residential subdivisions. And if you look at even further into the greater goals of our neighborhood, and our whole community, is to increase the number of owner-occupied homes in Homewood. Increase the number of owner-occupied.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, next slide, please, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think the things I would speak to here are, the reason why that notice went out to 40 people is because we're surrounded by commercial already. We have, to our right west, we have the parking deck of Meredith, or whatever it's called now, DOT, that has fire alarms that go off occasionally, and blinking that happens. So we're sensitive to that district. So our pocket is really the definition of MPD. It's a super scarce property type in our little pocket, and if you look farther, the gentleman made the comment of walking down hills and the connectivity that exists everywhere along Devon, Devon Drive. I lived on Devon for 6 years. So the challenge with Lakeshore, the challenge with MPD is the fact that it is in this immersed area of mixed use. But we would make the case that it's just so precedent setting. You've got an island that's sitting here. And it's being considered to be rezoning into a much higher density thing. And the precedence it sets, we'll get into a little bit longer, but it just creates, so I started digging deeper, and I went deeper into the master plan. And I looked at the vision for Homewood that was articulated by the residents. Focus on neighborhoods. That was the thing. So when I look at the goals, the greater goals, I think there were like 15 of them. Owner occupied really stood out. This is a total rent proposal. This is just a senior level apartment is what I see. It's beautiful, it looks great, but it's renters. And to our north, we have an entire apartment complex that's across the street, super transient. And our little cul-de-sac is MPD, and that's what we got. That's the houses that we have. The other thing I would say is that the intent of the goals of the master plan with a buffer Homewood single-family residential areas from incompatible land uses. And that's one I really struggled with, read deeper into it. And then ultimately, the greater goal was to enhance and preserve the environmental qualities. And I looked at the satellite imagery on the back of the back of this notice, and I couldn't help but realize, like, every tree in our entire backyard is going to be gone. You don't preserve trees in construction like that. So that entire canopy, I read urban canopy several times in the master plan. It's everywhere. Those words are everywhere. That's gonna be completely decimated. We're gonna have clean views of our south end, all the way into the parking deck across the street at Meredith. So those are some of the things I would point out to you in terms of incompatibility where we currently are.
And just as a side note, this neighborhood was devastated by the tornadoes last year that hit in December of '23, and so we lost a lot of trees already in throughout the neighborhood. Okay. So as it relates to the master plan, I did want to point out that I had consulted with a demographer who is employed by the Homewood City Schools and asked about the latest enrollment projections for Homewood City Schools and what they base that on. And they do base it in part with single-family homes and residences. And between 2016 and 2024, Homewood has lost 54 single-family residences. So, and that's recent data. If you can go to the next slide, please. Traffic and infrastructure concerns, we've already talked about this with entrance and exit on Old Montgomery. If you saw the video, that was a very Disney-esque video of Old Montgomery Highway. I wish it looked like that, but it's very narrow, it's very congested, and if you've had children at Homewood High School, you know that you pray that they're able to get through that intersection without cause or accident. It is congested, to say the least. We struggle getting out of our neighborhood at 8 o'clock in the morning to try to get to work or school because it's backed up either from 31 to Old Montgomery or vice versa. And it cannot be understated that this high-density residential area will add traffic. I know that there are traffic studies, and again, I'm not sure about if they're considering all of the traffic, visitors, deliveries, emergency services, staff, etc. The potential for visitors and staff for special occasions. My parents live at St. Martin's in the Pines, and when we're there, for a special occasion, sometimes the cars spill over into that Irondale community. I think about that, and I certainly think about it now. And then the infrastructure. The water, sewer, and stormwater systems just were designed for low density. Next slide, please.
Yeah, as Andy mentioned on the tree removal, I would note in Article, I think it's Article 9 of the master plan, there's a whole, I think it's just our goal is to point out certain things that are obstacles here. Major portions of the urban tree canopy will be conserved and respected by the master plan. And that's where when I see the application, when I see the material that's shared with us, it creates this friction in the document that's to guide whether we think this is a good idea or not, as well as the feedback from our neighbors.
And we've addressed the stormwater runoff. We all know that Lakeshore has a tendency to flood, so this impervious surfaces would allow for more flooding. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is obvious. You guys would know this. If something was like this was being built in your backyard, you would obviously be concerned about noise and light pollution as well. I think in the work session, that was a topic of conversation, the 24/7 operations, the emergency service vehicles that would come with sirens on back and forth. Also, having parents chronically and terminally ill, I know how often emergency services are called to St. Martin's. I know that they use their sirens, and I think about those residents, and of course I think about them more even now. The light pollution, outdoor lighting for parking and security impacts residential. I don't care how low it is past my sight line. It is going to be quite obvious to our backyard. And if you'll go to the next slide, please, on precedent and property values.
Yeah, so I was looking deep into the EMS services. So Washington Post analyzed, I think it's a full year or 2 years worth of 911 calls from assisted living facilities. That's increased 30% since 2020. The why there is that the assisted living centers employees are not allowed to pick up patients in certain cases, so they just call 911. That puts pressure on the fire department to come in and pick patients up, and it could just be someone laying right there that needs to be, they call it a lift in place. We didn't have any details in our first meeting on Atlas, so I don't know what kind of level of employee they have there, but that's a question mark of, does that perpetuate the noise level? I think from that perspective, it puts risk on our property values having right behind us, but also it actually, in a weird way, creates this interesting incentive in the community that you can take 9 properties that are MPD, that are worth a certain level, just use estimate levels, a certain level, and you move them over to this other rezoning, and like through some sort of arbitrage, this value becomes so much greater. And I just wonder, like, what kind of message that sends to the community to say, let's buy, block buy land, make a case to convert it to another rezoning type, and then cash in on the value of that. I just think it creates an incredible precedent of the number of people that will pursue the MPD to some higher density to increase the value they hold in Homewood.
Also, I wanted to bring up a couple of things. We are speaking on behalf of the neighbors. There are some that have passed down these houses from generation to generation. And we have the original covenant with First Baptist of Birmingham, where they agreed to protect and preserve the surrounding community. So I have a copy of that. And, in 27, the First Baptist Church of Birmingham also requested a rezoning at that time. And when we went in front of the neighborhood meeting at the church, they kept telling us they wanted to be good neighbors. And to keep coming to us and asking us to turn from a neighborhood preservation district into a PR2, a very high density, it doesn't look like a great deal for us. Granted, it looks like a great deal for them. They're probably going to get more money from a developer, I get that, than selling it to 9 individuals. But I don't know that they're being a good neighbor and really setting and continuing the word of the people who came before them, who originally put the church there in 1984. We also, if you'll go to the next slide, have a copy of the 1947, and it was 47, Mr. Plosser, that the Hughes Circle was established. In 1938 is when Ashley Circle and Ashley Drive were established. And Mr. Wright sold the property, and the original intent of his sale was to make sure that it was single-family homes. So I have a copy of that covenant as well. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Is this me or you? Oh, that's me. Sorry. We talked about this in the neighborhood meeting, but just what was really obvious and what the developers pretty much got their act together quickly since our last meeting was the fact that the buffers just were not adequate between our homes and what they are proposing as this development. And Jason found the violation of the Article 6 criteria failing to meet that open space and vegetated buffered standards. Then lastly, which they seem like they've shored up a little bit since we met a week ago, but the holes in the data research with the traffic impact study, considering congestion, safety risk, and first responder resources, the environmental impact assessment, don't know that that's there. Property value study, I still haven't heard them say anything about what our properties are worth versus what they could be worth or the depreciation thereof if a property like this is on right behind our properties. Anything else?
Yeah, I'd have one more statement. In terms of a cure for insomnia, you can read the Homewood Master Plan and learn a lot, but I did find this passage compelling. The plan is concerned not about attaining so-called highest and best use for every parcel of land in the city. Rather, it seeks to assist residents and property owners and city officials with the much more difficult task of finding and arranging a pattern of the most fitting and appropriate uses and densities of whole neighborhoods that will be compatible with residents and the overall community and the quality of life they share.
So we believe that is the spirit that Homewood is founded upon, continues upon, and wants to continue with it with Neighborhood Preservation District. That's the spirit of Homewood. If you'll go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is not complete because people were calling me as I arrived here and I couldn't change the PowerPoint. But we have the vast majority of neighbors saying no to this. In fact, we have 4 more that called me on the way here. So you can fill those in. One of the houses is owned by the church, but due to time constraints, we just could not get to everybody, and we couldn't, get everybody's input on this. But this shows you that this is the overwhelming majority, which, by the way, is made up of 50% senior citizens. And if you really want to get down to brass tacks, I'm one as well. So I'm a grandmother, 56 years old. I am in the demographic. The next slide, please. In addition to that, for about 4 days, we put a petition up on social media and got about, I think it's sitting at about 150 some odd people. And these are people not only sitting in this room, but throughout Homewood who care about preserving the NPD status. They don't want it to happen in their neighborhoods. They are throughout Homewood, and their names are represented here. Again, it's the spirit of Homewood. If you'll go to the next. This is just our contact information. We're happy to talk about any of these things with you, the developers, the church. I think the bottom line is that it's advantageous, possibly, for the church to go this route and rezone and purchase, or sell rather. It's advantageous for the neighbors to retain it as an NPD for many, many reasons, and for the church to sell individually to 9 individual homeowners and to be our neighbors. We'd love for them to be our neighbors. Anything else, Jason?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to speak on this case?
Good evening. My name is Gretchen Southern, and I live at 1936 Shadescliff Terrace. 1936 Shadescliff Terrace is a multi-family unit, but I do own my condominium. We live up the hill, across Lake Shore, above the high school. Our residents travel 31 and Old Montgomery Highway on a daily basis, going in and out of our homes. If we leave our units, if we go up the hill, we can only go towards 31 and towards Vestavia. So most residents do use Old Montgomery Highway down to the Lake Shore intersection. I believe also that by accepting this change in residential status, that it sets a precedent. Since I've lived here 20 years, I've seen the Baptist Church buy up individual houses in that neighborhood and rent them. I've seen the yards and how they're cared for deteriorate, and the structures. I can see that if you allow this change, that the church will feel that it has a right to do the same thing to Ashley Drive. And I think that's a detriment to our citizens and to everybody in Homewood with the plan. My other concern is with the parking. We all know that Homewood has an issue of not providing enough parking whenever they allow new construction and commercial buildings. That area does not allow for extra parking for the people who live there. Now, no one has stated how many residents will live in that 3-story building and how many employees will live in that 3-story building. But I can tell you that my mother was in Brookwood for a while when we brought her here from Louisiana, and she's been in other facilities prior to her death in my home with hospice. Changes in shifts in medical facilities and facilities like that, they said it wouldn't be a problem, but the high school lets out between 3 and 4, depending on, and there's a lot of high school students in that range when they're coming to and from after extracurricular activities. Those students, many of them use the Old Montgomery Highway to get to school and to get home. I believe the ingress and egress of staff would put some of those students at risk because shifts usually run either 8 to 4:30 or 5, or you could do the 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7. And many people are dropping their children off at school at those times as well. So if you'll just consider those items, I would appreciate it. I don't speak for all of my neighbors in the Hermitage condos, but several people have spoken with me and expressed their concerns as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else from the public seek to speak on this case? Okay, seeing no one, we will close the public portion, and if the applicant could come back up, I guess the whole team, and answer questions from the commission.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond to questions and concerns that were raised tonight. I have a running list here, but certainly if there are others that I've missed and the commission points those out, we'll be glad to address those as well. The first on my list are related to buffers, primarily landscaping buffers related, I believe, site lighting, and storm water, and potential impacts to lakeshore and properties other than this particular parcel. Brian is probably the best person to speak to those particular concerns.
Yeah, as far as landscape buffers go, PR2 requires a 12-foot or 10-foot buffer that includes trees and bushes that are 6 foot high within 1 year. Our plan between our development and the adjacent residential lots would be to provide that. In addition to that, though, if based on the way our site plan is laid out, we're providing an additional green space that accounts for between 30 and 50 feet, depending on where you are on the site, before you get to any kind of hardscape. A lot of times we set the building at the building setback line and you go and put the parking in front of it, and then you end up with hardscape between the two. We set this one to where you've got additional green space, not to mention that the houses' roof elevations are 10 to 20 feet down. So as far as buffers go between us and the residential adjacent to us, we're meeting the PR2 requirements and including native species of trees and bushes. As far as site lighting goes, we'll of course have to meet the City of Homewood standards for site lighting. I'm sure it'll be all LED lighting. I would imagine very little street lighting going up the street toward residential, it'll be more residential style, house lights, front porch lights, not high bay parking lights like you would see at a commercial development. That's kind of the part of beauty of this project is you're transitioning up the hill from a more commercial use in the 3-story to a residential use going up the hill. So you transition from normal parking lot lighting that you would see into a residential style that would match more of what would be on Ashley Circle or Ashley Road anyway. Stormwater, we're proposing doing all of our detention underground for stormwater, meet the requirements for the city of Homewood for quantity and quality, tying into Lake Shore. So that way we could ensure a pre versus post meeting of the design. Also, it lets us control velocities and not have any erosion going out on toward Lake Shore. As we all know, the Lake Shore ditch on our side of the road is pretty small right there anyway, and then ties directly into the river across the street. So that'll let us contain our water, hold our water, delay it, and because our detention will be so much higher than the river, it will also allow us not to have the river back into us because our detention will be 20 feet higher than the existing water surface. Just kind of running through a couple of more items that were mentioned as we went through this, we just kind of run through the civil site stuff before you get into some operational stuff. The tree canopy removal was mentioned. City of Homewood has a really good landscape ordinance that requires putting back trees. Our plan proposes putting back the trees on a rate of 24 per acre, which for this development is 153 new trees based on the construction that we're putting in. That's shown on the drawings, that's what's planned, and we intend to meet that requirement in its entirety. One other thing to note is PR2 requires a max building coverage of 35% of the site, and we are below that with this development. And I think that's a pretty important thing to note in this development is the overall density of the site is fairly small. There is a pretty good amount of open space in this. This development is trying to be walkable. We're fighting for ADA throughout this development for the residents. We're trying to get access routes from every tier to each tier, so it's a truly walkable community for these residents. And that's difficult on this site that goes about 50 feet up the hill, which is kind of why you see the circuitous drive going up the hill, which gives us a route to get vehicles up there and pedestrians down the backside. Other thing to note that was in the presentation earlier that was mentioned somewhat in working with fire department in this process. We originally showed just the entrance closer to the larger building because we wanted safety for our residents to not have a second exit in and out that people could come in that wouldn't be as close to the main office or the main building where other people were working. So in working with the fire department, they wanted the second entrance in order to make sure they had circulation of their fire trucks. So we reworked the site plan a little bit. The access shown on the second access on Old Highway 31 is an option in conjunction with the one shown to the Baptist church. It's more of an either or option for those two, depending on whether or not we can get an easement through the Baptist church in perpetuity that will stick to this property. Either way, the entrances are gated for fire access only. That way we can limit the impact of multiple curb cuts on a street and people going a bunch of different directions. As far as the traffic goes, Skipper Consulting did a trip generation, as was mentioned earlier. They ran peak trips for peak hours for morning and afternoon. That's in your packet. And I believe it's on the order of 12 to 15 in and 12 to 15 out in that range for an hour in the morning and the afternoon. And then the shift times, John could probably talk a little bit better too, but I'm sure those can be shifted to avoid the true neighbor peak time, and the lakeshore peak time. Do you wanna talk about the parking, or you want me to talk about the parking with the?
You can address them and I can follow up if there's something else.
Okay. As far as parking goes, what we did, the way we looked at this, in order to not have huge parking lots everywhere, almost every building has a carport, has somewhat of a driveway. And that allows us to have parking at each one. That's, if you'll notice on the upper left, for example, that one has a single carport. The one to the right of it, that's a duplex unit, it actually has a carport, one spot for each unit inside that one covered area. So while it looks like one building, the carports are actually conjoined with a unit on each side. That kind of lets us keep this more of a residential feel, not have parking lots, however, provide the parking required for the code, and then provide the green space associated with it. I'll let you kind of
Sure, thanks, Brian. Backing up a little bit, I think one thing to note that might be a little bit different on this project, again, with it being a planned development, the roadways being constructed are private. So they're not gonna be your typical city streets and the regulations associated with those site lighting wise. So we're certainly not gonna have your typical 24-foot street lights. We have the flexibility and ability to almost remove entirely street lights to where everything could be home-mounted lighting. So I think we can certainly adequately address the lighting issue. Brian spoke to the landscape buffers. I think what we're providing is very robust, exceeds the requirements, and certainly with the 30-foot to 50-foot setbacks, adds some additional protections that you don't typically find on a project. I might hit property values as something else on my list before I get into the operational questions. Again, I certainly don't want to speak from a authority relative to property values. However, it was mentioned, I think it's a fair point, that the existing housing stock on Hugh certainly is in need of maintenance. There's deferred maintenance. I think the church would certainly acknowledge that. So impact on neighbors' property values versus what currently exists, or even what might exist if this were to be redeveloped in standalone single family. Our opinion is that the value created by our project certainly far exceeds the values that would be assessed to the underlying single family homes. With it being uniformly owned and maintained by the single operator, that's going to have to provide best-in-class service in order to attract and retain residents. I think the long-term capital needs of this project certainly would be addressed very proactively. So again, all I can offer is an opinion on value. I'm no authority, but I don't foresee that this project could possibly negatively impact property values of adjacent parcels at all. We addressed the parking. It certainly is a relevant point, good point for special events parking. It is beneficial to have a sea of parking, a tremendous amount of currently existing impervious area at the Baptist church that could be for the benefit of the project for overflow parking for special events. So I think, this location does benefit from that location and proximity. EMS response and number of residents and number of employees and shift changes are kind of my next piece, and maybe those are kind of all under the same operational related questions. As we mentioned at the neighborhood meeting and did not earlier tonight, so I do apologize about that, but the anticipated maximum number of employees on the site at any one time, any peak time, is 28 persons, 28 employees. Shift changes of those employees We certainly have absolute authority over those. Typical shift change, I'm told, occurs at 6 a.m. So those are outside the hours of what we believe to be the peak traffic generation times on Old Montgomery. But whatever those peak generation times are determined to be, we certainly have a flexibility related to shift changes of the employees. Because that certainly would be when most traffic would be generated from this project. EMS response, our operators telling us they've surveyed the 36 projects that they operate. And they wanted me to make sure I address the fact that, again, this project is independent living, assisted living, memory care. So this is not a nursing home. This is not a skilled nursing facility that do typically generate more calls. Their experience, again, they surveyed all 36 of their properties and looked historically at that, because that is a very big piece of their business. They tell us that between 4 to 5 generations a week is what they typically incur at a property of this size. They further tell us, again, this would certainly be something we would want the local EMS folks to address, but they tell us they work hand in hand typically with the EMS response folks, and they are able to not roll with sirens and lights in most every instance. So again, that's something we need to vet out, but that's what our operator is telling us. Relative to the number of residents, again, in the mass building containing the assisted living and memory care, we have 94 potential total occupancy there, and then in the cottage portion, we have 24. That is everything that I had on my list.
I've got one other item that was mentioned earlier, and it was the scale and aesthetics item, which is one of the first ones in the PowerPoint. But I think this property is very unique in that when you look along Lakeshore Drive proper, the scale of the building that we're proposing mimics the scale of the Baptist church, the office building across the street, the parking decks that Sanford owns, and mimics the buildings going down Lakeshore. As you turn up Old 31, that zone transitions into residential, which the northern half of our project mimics. I think one thing that's important to note is the large building on our property actually does not sit as far back as the Baptist church directly next to it. The rear of it does not stick as far back to the north toward the adjacent residential as the Baptist church. It's not as close to the residential as the deck on the other side of Old 31 that Sanford now owns. I think that's what makes this project and this property unique, is this project seems to blend the scale of Lakeshore with the scale of the residential as you go north. And I think that's kind of important to understand in this process of scale and aesthetics of how this zone transitions from one to the other.
One other point that was made tonight that I do think was certainly resonated with me is that seniors' response to this area geographically is a positive thing. So I was very encouraged to hear the number of seniors that currently occupy this neighborhood, and I think that lends itself to our belief that this is a great location for this housing deliverable, and will be well received by those in the community who are advancing in age. Again, the demographics are what they are. They certainly are not slowing down any time, and more folks in our community are in the market for and in need of this type housing deliverable. Unless there are any other questions of us, I did just want to state again that, again, our offer was that we certainly are willing to continue discussions if we think that's helpful, knowing that the process continues on through the city, and we'll make ourselves available to neighbors throughout the process, certainly, to work through questions, concerns, to the extent we can answer additional questions. So I just want to make that
All right, well,
offer
thank
again.
you. I think we have some questions. I know you were trying to address the questions that came up in the public portion. I'm sure we have some questions as well. I will start off with one, just, I guess, filling in a blank, because I was interested in this. The staff, you said the shift is a 6 a.m. shift. I imagine there are multiple shifts over the course of the
Yes,
day. And I was
yes.
trying to get a, so
Generally
yeah, are
3
these
shifts.
3 8-hour shifts? So it would be 6, 2, 10, 6?
6'2".
I mean, if
They
they're-
actually are varied from facility to facility in terms of when the shift changes occur.
Right,
Yeah,
but
that's
I think,
flexibility.
the reason I'm asking this question is I have 2 kids at the high school now, and I know in between 7:30 and 8, and they're driving faster at 8 than they were at 7:30. And then the afternoon school lets out, from 3 to 3:30. I know there's some people leaving after that, but I can understand that being a concern. I just wanted to kind of get a sense as to when
Agree. So,
your folks
so,
are.
so again, the employee roster at the property varies, right? So you'd have your administrative staff. You're obviously going to have food and beverage is a very large component of this deliverable. So you'll have folks who work in that category of providers in the space. So we're being told the typical shift changes are 6, 2, and 10. Again, we have complete flexibility on that front, but that is the typical that the operator
And
suggests.
where do you intend the staff to park on site? Or I know you mentioned something about the church, hopefully working out something, but as of now, do you plan?
That's right. So we're providing 100 parking spaces on this site.
There's adequate parking now for the staff to park on the site.
Okay.
That's right.
That represents an option for additional parking or overflow parking, but we're not counting on that. The amount of spaces provided is sufficient for staff and visitors and any residents who also have cars.
But the intent is to pursue some form of shared parking with the church in the event we have events that need, or a staff change that they need to alternate.
Okay.
That is something that's being pursued.
That 100 spaces is at the 3-story building or is in the total?
That's the total
That's the
parking
total.
across the property.
So at a 6 o'clock shift, you would have, roughly 56 cars out there, right? You would have the people that came and the people that are leaving, right, for some period of time. At every shift change, you would have double the
and
number of people working, right?
kind of. Like, like he said a second ago, it kind of breaks down to the function of job. So, if I'm reading this right, like
That's right.
6, 2, and 10 is for care associates. Dining is more like a 5 and a 1 time frame. So they're not all necessarily 28 walk out, 28 walk in, like
Administrative or another time frame.
like a shift work steel mill would be, for lack of a better. So it's 28 on a shift, but the shifts are based on your job type. So they may vary an hour. If that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
I'm thinking about it more in the way you guys presented was that we didn't have to worry about as much the congested times but now if they vary, then that means that
Well, based on what the email they sent us was, dining is 5 and 1 for shift change, so 5 a.m., 1 p.m. And care associates is 6, 2, and 10.
now they also did mention, I guess, the support services, right, that need to do deliveries. I guess that'll be at some point daily, I'm sure.
That's right.
Throughout the day.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, the traffic study does address that. The traffic study addresses the operations of the property.
So
that
those
would
numbers you
include-
gave include
That's right. That does
Yes.
include all support services to support the property. The unfortunate thing for us, because I'm asked the question too, and I'm trying to drill down to a little bit more analytics into the parking counts, but unfortunately they don't. They can't separate resident vehicular movements versus staff vehicular movements versus service vehicular movements. It's just combined into one operation of the facility.
The traffic standards that the traffic engineers develop don't do anything other than count cars all day long. They're not distinguishing
Right.
whether they're residents, whether they're visitors, what shift they're on, they just count them. And they distribute, and it's all across the 24-hour period. So what they're saying is that at the time which their counts peak in the morning and the afternoon, the impact on adjacent traffic is essentially the equivalent of one vehicle every 4 to 5 minutes. So if they were, that's about, you know, you can't take it and transpose it back to these numbers exactly because they were derived differently. But in theory, the traffic engineering manual includes everybody, but you can't disaggregate them.
It's about trips generated per
Yeah,
use.
period.
It's just,
At what time?
yeah.
I mean, listening to the presentation from the neighborhood, I would be remiss without saying that, you know, you are gonna replace the trees, but you aren't gonna replace the trees with like trees, right? You got 100-year-old trees you replace with 6-foot trees, so there's a difference there, right? And then you have, you know, a car study, right? But it's not accounting for the fact that Old Montgomery Highway would be a very narrow road for things like delivery vehicles, where kids going back and forth to high school might be an issue for them, or that, you know, we have these emergency vehicles that come in, and it sounds light to say that there's 5 per week. There could be more, but 5 per week is more than they anticipate having today. So there are some drawbacks to that, and I mean, that's very clear.
Well, you have institutions that are served off of that street as well, Lakeshore, which is in itself a hospital plus a recreation facility. So, and with food services and all of that sort. So that's happening already there. And our study is not focused on what the conditions are on 31. It's just identifying what the impact on those conditions would be from this facility.
That's right.
Okay? And they've not done current counts on 31. The city has recently, I don't know.
I just wanted to make the point that, I mean, they're talking about moving from MPD to another zone, and some of the reasons why it's MPD and why they support that is, as we was discussing, more than just traffic.
Certainly.
All right, I've got one question. You had mentioned earlier about a transportation board mentioned that, or recommended you use Old Montgomery Highway instead of Lake Shore. Any particular reason why that they made that recommendation, or ALDOT?
Yeah, that's who it was. Brian.
We talked to Skipper Consulting when we started this process. Looking at the traffic volumes on Lake Shore, looking at the traffic on Old 31, looking at the proximity of the red lights to both, and access on Lake Shore, unless it was pushed right next to the Baptist Church entrance, which would then be too close to the Baptist Church entrance, technically violates the ALDOT access manual. Where Hugh Circle is now technically does not meet their requirements. And so we've approached ALDOT and had a conversation. Their generic stance is always less curb cuts on their roads, the better. And so we haven't gone through the full permitting process, obviously. It's been a very brief conversation, but based on the recommendations of the traffic consultant and some preliminary conversations and going through the management manual of what Lake Shore would look like, that's what led us to that entrance on Old 31. What led us to only have one entrance on Old 31 for true POVs was to limit the amount of curb cuts, to limit the location, and that way you didn't have multiple points of conflict entering a segment adjacent to our property.
So the entrance on 31 is limited access.
The northern one is gated for fire access only. The southern one is the access to the campus.
So not for public use on any given day, it's just,
The northern one, correct.
so,
Yeah, it'll stay gated with a Knox box just for fire department to use.
so the main in and out is on Lake Shore.
Yes. No, it's the one closest to Lakeshore on 31.
And just so I understand, something you mentioned earlier, that the entrances, there was an either or situation. There was an entrance on the development plan going to the church and then the two. Are you saying the fire department's gonna require the second one on Old Montgomery?
No, the fire department wants either the second one on Old Montgomery or a connection to the Baptist church parking lot. But we can only get the parking lot one if we can get it recorded in a deed to run perpetuity with that property forever. And that's what we're working through. And so on our development plan, we showed, and it's even noted option 1 or option 2, and says that because the fire department wants a second one, period, and those were his 2 options, he approved.
So just procedurally, Fred, I guess if there are 3 on there, we're approving 3, and if they take 1 away, that doesn't require an amendment. Versus if they wanted to add
Well,
1.
No, it sounds like it's shown on there, but as he pointed out, you're gonna have to have a resurvey at a later date,
Yeah.
where you're gonna resurvey that and record that, and so
Okay.
that decision will be made and
That's right.
recorded with that resurvey.
And at that time, the easement on the Baptist church parking lot would be recorded with it if that's the route it goes. So those would all be recorded and come back for a resurvey to here.
Yeah, you're gonna have to,
This might be a question for Mr. Smith. I think it was Ms. Sims brought up the covenant from Mr. Wright. I would assume if that was a covenant that attached the land as part of like covenant that attached to the land as opposed to some covenant in bylaws. Do you know what that is?
I had never seen that before.
I haven't seen it.
Are we aware of any encumbrances on the property that would, okay,
Oh, we don't know, I mean, we haven't read it, so.
okay.
It's my understanding you all met with neighbors before. Based on those meetings, what have you changed, if anything, to your plans?
Well, I think the buffers, as was indicated earlier, site lighting, again, currently, we're not showing street lighting on the plan at all. So the current plan is that all lighting would be from structures versus pole-mounted lighting. That light pollution certainly resonated.
And at the time we presented it, the buffers really weren't detailed. We had them, we just hadn't detailed them very specifically, so we've since tried to do that.
And at least on that stretch of buffer, whether it's 30 feet or 50 feet, depending on which east or west part of the property, is that going to incorporate the existing canopy there, at least the one, or is it all going to be new?
It'll all be new.
Okay.
It'll all be new.
Where would the construction trucks, this project, would they be coming in off of? I assume
Well,
off of.
It'd be a phased issue. Originally, they come off of Lakeshore, because that's where Hugh Circle is now. The way this property works is basically you cut the rear to fill the front. So as you built the front up, you would move around to where the permanent entrance is eventually.
I think I understand.
Does that make sense? So you would come off of Hugh now, as you cut the back and fill the front, this one would eventually get filled in. And then when that got to a certain level, you'd come off the side to be at the right elevation, because Old 31 goes up the hill, so.
Generally, as a condition of the permit for construction, those kinds of things are worked out with the city, and the city approves where those are gonna occur and when and so forth.
And we'd have
As
to,
a condition of permitting.
and we'd have to provide construction and insurance meet 8M standards, get Kel to approve it, and, work through all that, so.
Well, if there are no further questions, I would entertain a motion. I guess we're voting on these first.
I have one question. How many existing trees on the property are going to be removed and then replaced with how many?
Okay, if the applicant knows the answer to that question, well, I think they've already answered the second part of that, but, I appreciate your question. The public portion's closed, but if you can address that question.
I'll answer it. The question is, I don't specifically know a number, because the grading plan's not final. I think the intent would be to always save as many trees as you can to get the project in, because the more you save, the less you have to replace. So, I think the intent would be to save what we can, but I don't have a count right now. We don't have a final tree survey, and the grading plan is still preliminary. It works, but it's preliminary. So until that's finalized, there may be a tree well scenario, or save 1 or 2 here or there, or save 10 here or there. We just don't know at the moment.
All right, thank you. And with that, I'll entertain a motion for RZ-2-01.
With the reminder that all motions have to be made in the positive, I would move to approve. Are we doing them together or separately?
I will do them separately.
Okay, and did you want to start with the rezoning or with the development plan?
I think rezoning.
RZ 250201.
Second.
All right. Mr. Goulas,
No.
Ms. Andrus,
No.
Mr. Henninger,
Yes.
Mr. Armstead,
No.
Mr. Respento,
No.
Ms. Wilcott,
No.
and Mr. Roberts.
Yes. So your first case, we'll go forward to the city council with a 5-2 negative recommendation. And I would entertain a motion with respect to FD 02-02.
Again, with the motion being made in the positive, I would move to approve FD 250202.
Second.
All right. Mr. Goulas,
No.
Ms. Andrus,
No.
Mr. Henninger,
Yes.
Mr. Armstead,
No.
Mr. Respento,
Oh, no.
Ms. Wilcott,
No.
and Mr. Roberts.
Yes. And same vote on your second case. It'll go forward to city council with a 5-2 negative reference from our commission. Thank you. Okay. Any further communications from staff?
Just to remind the members in the audience, as you did earlier, that it will go to the city council. There will be a second public hearing, and all property owners within 500 feet will receive notice of the time and date of that second public hearing before the city council. But that's all, just to clarify that. Again,
Okay.
re-emphasize that.
Okay. Well, with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.